The year was 1944. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its people surviving on scraps of bread and watery soups. For millions, hunger was not a passing struggle. It was a daily companion, gnawing at the spirit as much as the body. In Germany, women endured ration cards that promised little more than meager portions of potatoes, cabbage or bread, stretched with sawdust and fillers. War had stolen away warmth, comfort and dignity, leaving only the bitter taste of scarcity. But across the Atlantic, a very different world existed. The United States, untouched by the devastation that consumed Europe, had fields of abundance, factories roaring with production, and kitchens where butter, sugar, and meat were still part of daily life. And when the tides of war brought German women prisoners of war into American custody, they stepped into this contrast with wide, disbelieving eyes. What they found was something they could never have imagined: plates filled with hearty stews, tender meats, golden bread, and even sweet desserts. To these women, accustomed to gnawing hunger and bare cupboards, the American meal was not just nourishment, it was a revelation. For the first time in years, they sat at tables where food did not represent survival alone, but generosity, plenty, and a glimpse into a world their homeland had long forgotten. This is the story of German women POWs, and the shocking moment when American meals showed them just how different life could be. When the German women first arrived at the American camps, they carried with them the weight of defeat. Their uniforms, once pressed and stiff with the pride of service, were now worn thin, patched and soiled from long marches and endless train rides across a continent collapsing in flames. Many had expected to be treated as enemies, starved, punished, or forgotten behind barbed wire. After all, in Germany, the propaganda machine had painted a terrifying picture of what awaited those who fell into Allied hands. They were told that capture meant humiliation, cruelty, and hunger. Yet when they passed through the gates of the American camps, what awaited them was nothing short of astonishing. The first surprise was not the camp itself, though even that startled them. The barracks were orderly, clean, and built with sturdy wood, rather than the makeshift ruins they had anticipated. The guards were firm, yes, but not vicious. And then, the most shocking moment arrived, their first meal. The women were ushered into a dining hall that looked more like a school cafeteria than a prison. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, benches neatly tucked beneath them. The air was heavy with scents they could barely process at first. Meat sizzling, bread freshly baked, coffee brewing. For some, it felt like stepping into a dream, one too fragile to be trusted. They shuffled forward in line, plates pressed into their hands. An American cook, his sleeves rolled up, ladled steaming beef stew onto the metal trays, the broth thick with vegetables that glistened in the light. Beside him, another man cut generous slices of bread still warm, the crust golden brown. Further down, pitchers of coffee were being poured, and next to them sat bowls of sugar, a luxury so rare in wartime Germany that many had forgotten what it even tasted like. The women exchanged nervous glances. Some hesitated to take the food, convinced it must be a cruel trick. Others accepted it silently, holding their trays as if they were carrying relics from another life. When they sat down at the tables, the silence was overwhelming. No laughter, no chatter, just the quiet scrape of spoons and forks as the first tentative bites were taken. A young woman lifted her bread to her lips, inhaling the aroma as though trying to memorize it. Another let the stew touch her tongue and closed her eyes, tears welling without warning. They had prepared themselves for punishment, for suffering. Instead, they found warmth. For years, German families had endured rationing so severe that many meals were little more than boiled turnips or watered-down soups. Meat was nearly non-existent, reserved for soldiers at the front. Coffee had been replaced with bitter substitutes brewed from roasted acorns or barley. Sugar, butter, and eggs had vanished from daily life, replaced with counterfeit versions that tasted of chemicals and ash. Bread, once the pride of German households, had become dark, heavy, and adulterated with fillers. ground peas, sawdust, even powdered straw. Food was survival, not nourishment, and mealtimes were marked by frustration, not comfort. And yet here, in an American camp, the women were confronted with a reality so different it bordered on unbelievable. Some were too cautious to eat quickly. They picked at their plates, fearing that taking too much would provoke anger. Others, overwhelmed by hunger and the sudden return of flavor, ate with urgency, their hands trembling as they shoveled spoonful after spoonful into their mouths. A few could not finish, not because they were full, but because the emotions were too much to bear. To eat freely, without ration cards, without fear, without shame. It was a simple act, but to them it was revolutionary. The guards watched quietly. They were not cruel men, nor were they overly sympathetic. To them, feeding prisoners was simply routine, a requirement of the Geneva Convention and a matter of order. But they could see the disbelief in the women's eyes, the way they lingered over every crumb of bread, as though committing it to memory. The Americans knew these women were enemies, yet the act of giving them food transformed the atmosphere. For a brief, fragile moment, the war outside seemed far away. One German woman, perhaps in her late 20s, later recalled in a hidden journal how her hands shook as she held the cup of coffee. She had not tasted real coffee since 1939, the year rationing began. For 5 years, her mornings had been filled with bitter, grainy substitutes. But in that camp, in her first days as a prisoner, she tasted it again. Dark, rich, and filled with a warmth she had thought lost forever. She described it as the moment she realized the world was larger than the Reich, larger than the hunger and propaganda she had been taught to endure. As more women filed into the dining halls in the days that followed, the pattern repeated itself. Shock, hesitation, silence, and then the slow realization that the meals were real, not a temporary display. The food was not a trick, not a fleeting gesture of mercy. It was consistent, served 3 times a day, with variety and substance. Stews gave way to roasts, beans to potatoes, and sometimes even desserts, slices of pie or cakes that left the women in quiet awe. To taste sugar again was to taste childhood, a memory of a world before bombs and battles. And yet, despite the abundance, the women never entirely shed their disbelief. Many would carefully tuck away pieces of bread or meat into pockets or cloths, hiding them under mattresses or inside coats, unable to trust that the next day would bring the same. Hunger had taught them not to trust, not to assume tomorrow would provide. Even in the face of American generosity, the instinct to hoard remained strong. For the Americans, these meals were standard, nothing extraordinary. But for the German women, they became symbols of something greater than food. They represented dignity, care, and a glimpse of life beyond the endless grind of scarcity. Sitting at those tables, eating bread that was soft and warm rather than coarse and bitter, they began to see cracks in the stories they had been told back home. The enemy, it turned out, could feed you better than your own leaders ever had. In the end, those first meals would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Not just the taste of the bread or the richness of the stew, but the feeling that came with it, the shock of being treated not as disposable captives, but as human beings worthy of nourishment. And that shock was perhaps the most unforgettable part of all. For the German women prisoners, every bite of the American meals was a reminder of what they had lost and what they had never truly known. In Germany, the word rationing had become a way of life, as common as the sound of air raid sirens or the sight of bombed-out buildings. Since 1939, families had been issued small, stiff ration cards, stamped and marked, to control every scrap of food that passed through their kitchens. Each week the cards were exchanged for pitiful portions: an ounce of butter, a slice of meat so thin it was translucent, a handful of flour that could hardly bake a loaf. Mothers stood in long lines outside shops, waiting for hours, only to find shelves empty when their turn finally came. And when they did receive food, it was often poor in quality, stretched with fillers that left bellies aching and spirits hollow. The women remembered how their bread, once a symbol of German pride and craftsmanship, had become almost inedible. Known bitterly as K-brot or Kriegsbrot, war bread, it was made not only with rye or wheat, but with ground-up peas, sawdust, and even straw to make it last. A loaf crumbled in their hands, its taste more of dirt than nourishment. Coffee, that sacred morning ritual, had long disappeared, replaced by what they called Ersatzkaffee, brewed from roasted acorns or chicory. It was bitter, sour, and left a film on the tongue that tasted like ash. Butter was replaced with a greasy yellow paste, and meat, true meat, was so rare that most families could recall only a handful of meals in an entire year, where it appeared on their plates, to sit now in an American dining hall and taste real food again was an experience that shook them deeply. They whispered to each other in disbelief, their voices hushed as though afraid that speaking too loudly might cause the illusion to vanish. "Can this be real?" one woman murmured to her neighbor, staring at a spoonful of stew, thick with beef and carrots. Another closed her eyes as she tasted sugar on her tongue, remembering birthdays from her childhood when cakes had been covered with frosting. For some, the flavor of butter spread on warm bread brought tears that they could not hide. It was not simply that they were hungry, it was that these flavors had become memories, and now they were alive again. Some women admitted later that they cried quietly during those meals. The act of eating freely was overwhelming, almost unbearable. They were reminded of years spent cutting potatoes into paper-thin slices to make them last longer, of boiling cabbage into endless soups that gave little more than water to drink. They remembered sneaking food to children, giving up their own share so their sons or daughters would not go to bed with stomachs growling. In Germany, hunger had not been a passing discomfort. It had been an unrelenting companion, gnawing at families until they were hollow-eyed and exhausted. To suddenly find themselves with more food than they could finish was like waking from a nightmare into a dream they were not sure they deserved. The shock was not only physical, but emotional. Eating was supposed to be punishment now. They were prisoners, the defeated, the conquered. And yet here they were, receiving better meals than many of their families back home. Some struggled with guilt, pushing food around their plates, thinking of mothers and sisters still in Germany, scraping together turnips or trading heirlooms for scraps at the black market. Others forced themselves to finish every bite, determined not to waste what their families could only dream of. They wrote secretly in notebooks and on scraps of paper, documenting the absurdity of it all. "Today I ate meat," one entry read. "Not a shadow of it, not a taste in broth, but real meat on my tongue. I cried while I ate, and the guards stared but said nothing. And yet despite the abundance before them, old habits died hard. Many women could not help but smuggle away portions of bread or meat, wrapping them in cloth and hiding them in pockets. They did not trust that this kindness would last. Years of hunger had trained them to hoard, to save for the unknown tomorrow. Beneath their beds, in corners of their barracks, bits of bread began to appear, carefully guarded as though famine might return at any moment. When guards found the hoarded food, they did not punish them harshly. They simply reminded the women that more meals would come. Still, the habit persisted. Hunger left scars deeper than wounds, and trust was not easily given. The Americans themselves could not fully understand the depth of this reaction. For them, the food served in camps was not luxurious. It was routine, standard army rations. Stews, beans, potatoes, bread, coffee, sometimes canned fruit or pie when supplies allowed. To the guards and cooks it was nothing special, just a duty to be carried out. But for the women across the tables it was extraordinary. To taste sweetness after years of bitterness, to chew bread that was soft instead of crumbling, to drink coffee that was rich and warm. It was not just sustenance, it was resurrection. As weeks passed, the whispers of disbelief turned into quiet acceptance. Though the astonishment never completely faded, the dining hall became a place where time seemed to pause, where the war outside the fences felt distant. It was in those moments, with spoons in hand and plates filled with warmth, that they began to sense the scale of contrast between life under the Reich and life outside it. They realized that the scarcity they had endured was not a universal truth of wartime, but the result of their nation's collapse, its corruption, its endless grasp for conquest at the cost of its people. One woman later confessed that she felt a strange shame while eating in America. She had once believed the Reich's promise of strength, of greatness, of a nation that cared for its people. Yet here she was, being fed not by her own government, but by her enemies, and fed better than she had been in years. Every bite tasted of contradiction, every swallow carried both gratitude and guilt. It was food, yes, but it was also a mirror, showing her what her homeland had taken from her. These meals, simple as they were, became the most powerful symbol of captivity. Not the fences, not the guards, not the uniforms, but the food. Each plate told a story of contrast, of lies revealed, of survival beyond what they had imagined possible. And though many of them longed for home, they could not deny that here, for the first time in years, they ate like human beings again. As the days stretched into weeks, the rhythm of camp life settled into a strange and almost unsettling normalcy. For the German women prisoners, the initial shock of abundance never entirely faded, but it began to soften into quiet routine. The dining hall, once a place of disbelief and trembling hands, became the moment they looked forward to with anticipation. The clang of the bell announcing mealtime carried across the barracks like a sacred call, and even those burdened by despair felt a flicker of light in their hearts. To eat, to sit together, to feel human again. These moments carved out a fragile refuge from the reality that they were captives in a foreign land. At first, many approached each meal with suspicion, convinced it could not last. They half expected the bread to disappear, the stew to thin into water, the coffee to return to bitter substitutes. Yet day after day the meals came, consistent and plentiful. Slowly, the disbelief gave way to trust, though never fully. Some women continued to hoard food under their mattresses or inside shoes, their instincts too deeply ingrained to abandon. Others began to savor each meal openly, no longer hiding their smiles when a piece of cake appeared on the tray or when butter melted into the crust of bread. These small luxuries, forgotten in Germany, now carried almost spiritual weight. Many of the women began writing in secret diaries, fragments of thoughts scribbled on scraps of paper, margins of old letters, or the backs of ration cards they had smuggled with them from home. They wrote not only about the food, but about what the food represented. To be fed well by one's captors was more than kindness, it was dignity. One prisoner described how each meal seemed to say, "You are still a person, not just an enemy." Another wrote that the bread she ate in America tasted sweeter than anything she had known, not because of sugar, but because it came without fear. Evenings in the camp became a time of reflection. After meals, the women would return to their barracks, their stomachs full, their bodies warm. Some would whisper in the dim light, comparing notes on what they had eaten, recalling memories of Germany before the war had consumed everything. They spoke of childhood kitchens filled with the smell of roasted meat, of grandmothers baking loaves that crackled as they cooled, of birthdays and Christmases when sugar and butter flowed freely. For years, those memories had been buried under hunger and fear. Now with each American meal, they resurfaced like ghosts. The dining hall itself became a stage of quiet transformation. Under the yellow glow of hanging lamps, the clatter of utensils filled the space with a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Guards walked the aisles, watchful but not unkind, while cooks moved behind the counters with practiced ease. There was order but also humanity. The women sat shoulder to shoulder, sometimes exchanging shy smiles, sometimes simply eating in silence. It was here, more than anywhere else in the camp, that they felt the sharp divide between the Reich they had left behind and the America that now held them. For many, the meals marked a turning point in their understanding of the war. Back home, propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal, merciless conquerors, intent on crushing Germany into dust. But here they were, being given meals far richer than what their families were receiving under Hitler's rule. Each tray of food was like a crack in the wall of lies, showing them a glimpse of another reality. Some admitted to themselves in whispers they dared not speak aloud that perhaps everything they had been told was not true. Still, the emotions were complex. Gratitude mingled with guilt, comfort clashed with longing. While they ate, many thought of their mothers, sisters, and children back home, still scraping together meals from thin rations and black market scraps. Letters from Germany, when they came, were filled with stories of hunger, of trading heirlooms for food, of empty shelves and endless queues. To eat so well in captivity while their families starved was a burden almost as heavy as hunger itself. Some women confessed in their diaries that every spoonful of stew was shadowed by the thought of who was going without. And yet, the meals also became a source of resilience. They gave strength not only to the body, but to the spirit. Sitting in that dining hall, sharing bread and coffee, the women began to find a strange camaraderie among themselves. Differences of background and rank faded. Hunger and disbelief were universal. They comforted each other when tears came. They exchanged quiet jokes, and they began to form fragile bonds that made captivity bearable. Food, in this way, became not only survival, but also connection. There were moments of quiet beauty, too, moments the women never forgot. A shaft of sunlight falling across a loaf of bread, turning its crust golden. The sound of laughter returning, hesitant at first, but genuine as they sipped coffee together. The warmth of stew filling their bellies on cold evenings when frost clung to the windows of the barracks. These details, small and ordinary in peace, became profound in war. For many, they were the first true reminders of life before the Reich, before scarcity, before everything was consumed by the machine of conflict. Years later, those who survived captivity would recall the meals as among their most vivid memories. Not the fences, not the guards, not even the barracks, but the food. They remembered the shock of abundance, the taste of sugar, the smell of coffee, the weight of bread still warm from the oven. They remembered the silence of the first meal, when disbelief held their tongues, and the gradual return of conversation as hope crept back into their hearts. They remembered the way each meal seemed to offer not just nourishment, but a glimpse into a different world, a world they had been told did not exist. In the end, the American dining tables of abundance became something far greater than sustenance. They became symbols of dignity, of humanity, of the possibility that life could be different from what they had known. For women who had been taught to see themselves as tools of war, as mothers of soldiers, as bearers of sacrifice, these meals reminded them that they were still individuals, still people worthy of care. And though the war would rage on outside, and though their captivity was far from freedom, the act of sitting together at those tables changed something within them forever.